The war on drugs. It's a global battle that has lasted for decades, cost trillions of dollars, and taken countless lives. Today we'll be taking a deep look into how three countries, the UK, the US, and the Philippines, have waged their own wars on drugs. We'll examine the political decisions that shape these wars, the influence of leaders, and most importantly, what the future could mean for drugs and the prospects for reform. Stick around because by the end, we'll have a much clearer view on how the war of drugs has evolved over time and what we could do to combat it in the future. So, let's start with the US. In my opinion, the biggest war on drugs has been waged by the US in recent history. And it all started in 1971, when President Nixon announced that drug abuse was public enemy number one. And I just think that's a really important quote, especially for what was going on in the time. In 1971, it was a really turbulent time for the US. There was the Vietnam War, the leak of the Pentagon Papers to be precise. There were many economic troubles with the higher inflation that the US was facing. And President Nixon chose to highlight the war on drugs. And I think it just shows that from the start, the US was very dedicated to making sure that the war on drugs was successful. And it's just quite sad to see how over time, that dedication and effort has just diminished. This led to the Controlled Substances Act, which established the drug scheduling system that still exists to this day. Now, to be completely honest, I think when people say the war on drugs, people think that it's purely about drugs, when in reality, it was a much more complex idea. It was a much more complex concept. When President Nixon announced the war on drugs, well, there's multiple reasons behind it. Well, for one, he wanted to use it as a springboard for the upcoming 1972 elections, which in the end, he did win. So we can see that he was successful. The war on drugs was also political, coming off the heels of the 1960s civil rights movements, the whole segregation, the culture clash in the US. I think the war on drugs just highlighted the issues that were in the US at the time. All the racism and the stereotypes about different races in the US were brought to light. There's even more information showing us that for President Nixon, the war on drugs wasn't just about public health. In 1904, in a really shocking interview, one of his top advisors, John Ehrlichman, admitted that the war on drugs was meant to target African Americans and the anti-war activists. By associating these groups with drugs, the Nixon administration could arrest them, raid their houses, and discredit them publicly. And I think it's just a giant shame that President Nixon used the war on drugs for his own personal motivations. I mean, what could have been done if the US, using all of its resources, actually tried to fix the drug problem? I mean, the world would be just a much more different place than it is right now. And it's really heartbreaking when you read this kind of stuff and you see what his advisors have said and what they admit that they were using it to target minorities, certain groups. I mean, doesn't it just seem wrong? And even after his presidency was over, Nixon's drug war laid the groundworks for hard-on-drugs crime policies, and this negatively impacted certain minority groups, such as Black and Latino communities. Now, if we fast forward to 1980, the new president, Ronald Reagan, has just taken this war on drugs to a whole new level. Under Reagan, federal drug enforcement budgets skyrocketed, and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 introduced mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. Now, although Ronald Reagan was known as the great communicator and especially known for his charismatic charm, I just want to highlight what unbelievable damage he has done to the Black community through his war on drugs. And this is seen in one of the most controversial aspects of the act, where crack cocaine, which was primarily used in Black communities, carried a much harsher sentence than powder cocaine, which is commonly used in richer white communities. I think one of the most insane aspects of this act was the fact that 5 grams of crack cocaine carried the same sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine. This just led to a giant disparity in the races at prison, and so many more Black Americans were incarcerated due to this aspect of the act. Between 1980 and the 2000s, the US prison population quadrupled, with the majority of those incarcerated serving time for non-violent drug offenses. While Reagan's administration pushed the Just Say No campaign, addiction rates continued to climb and the prison system became overwhelmed. And in reality, the war on drugs, led by President Nixon and President Reagan, were nothing more than a way to gain political popularity. Under Bill Clinton, the 1994 crime bill further ramped up incarceration. And while Clinton later expressed regret for the bill, its impact on mass incarceration, particularly in communities of color, was profound. And it wasn't until Barack Obama's administration that we started to see a shift in tone. Obama's 2010 Fair Sentencing Act reduced the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. By the end of Obama's presidency, many states had legalized cannabis, and there were signs that criminal justice was beginning to move forward in the US. However, The opioid epidemic has emerged as a new challenge, and I'm excited to see how either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump address this problem, because I do believe it's a problem, and I believe it's just growing larger and larger by the day. I think that instead of trying to punish those who have committed the crimes, we should be trying to address the problem at its roots. Try and figure out why people are turning to drugs. What can we do to help them? What kind of centers can we set up? What can we do as a country to try and prevent this kind of problem? Now, let's discuss the UK and their approach to the war on drugs. And while their war on drugs has not been as highly publicized or as aggressive, the UK has tried to take a more public health oriented stance, and this just means that the UK is focusing more on harm reduction, for example by setting up treatment centers for those addicted to drugs, rather than choosing to imprison them. In the UK, the war on drugs officially started with the Misuse of Drugs Act of 1971. This legislation classified drugs into three classes: Class A, Class B, and Class C. Class A drugs, such as heroin and cocaine, were seen as the most dangerous types of drugs. But the UK's war on drugs started much earlier. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, opium and cocaine were widely used, often legally and even prescribed by doctors. It wasn't until the post-World War II period, as the counterculture movement took hold in the 1960s, that drug use became seen as a social problem in need of strict policing. The 1960s counterculture brought recreational drug use into the mainstream, with substances like LSD, cannabis, and heroin becoming popular amongst the youth. This led to a political and social backlash, culminating in the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1967, which paved the way for the stricter Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971. Now, in the 1980s, there was a huge problem brewing in the UK. Under Margaret Thatcher's government, a heroin epidemic was forming. Britain saw a significant rise in heroin use, particularly in economically devastated cities like Liverpool and Glasgow. This period was fueled by a combination of unemployment, poverty, and urban decay. Rather than addressing the root causes of addiction, Thatcher's government decided to adopt a hard-on-crime policy. Now, I'm sure you've realized that this was also used in the US, and we all know that didn't pan out too well. So, when in the UK, policing was ramped up and harsh penalties were introduced, this led to addiction rates not going down, even though there were increasing arrests. In fact, by the end of the decade, overdose deaths had skyrocketed. Between 1980 and 1985, the number of heroin users in the UK tripled, with drug-related crime rising sharply. Despite this, the focus remained on punishment and not treatment, and the British government spent millions on law enforcement but little on rehabilitation. This just shows that the war on drugs should not be committed to being tough on people. Instead, we should be trying to help them and try to understand why they started using drugs and what can we do to prevent this in the future. With Tony Blair's new Labour government in 1997, so came a new approach to drug policing. While Labour was still advocating for law and order, they recognized that the war on drugs couldn't be won through policing alone. In 2001, they released a controversial new policy, the reclassification of cannabis from a Class B to a Class C drug. Now, at the time, this was seen as a step forward towards decriminalization, with less resources being used on the police, and instead we could focus on harder drugs such as cocaine and heroin. However, the move was short-lived. Just a few years later, in 2008, cannabis was reclassified back to Class B under Gordon Brown's government due to political pressure and concerns about rising use among teenagers. Now, recently, the UK has seen a new push for harm reduction policies, especially in Scotland. With drug-related deaths hitting an all-time new high, activists and some politicians are advocating for drug consumption rooms and greater access to addiction treatment programs. Now, in conclusion, the UK's war on drugs has been marked by strict law and order, but with increasing emphasis on harm reduction and treating addiction as a public health issue. While it has avoided the extreme punitive measures and mass incarceration seen in the US, the UK's approach still faces challenges in balancing criminal justice with effective rehabilitation and support for affected communities. Moving forward, the focus on public health and treatment could offer more sustainable solutions to the country's drug-related problems. Now, let's discuss the Philippines and their approach on the war on drugs. To be completely honest, I don't know that much about the Philippines. I'm not from there, I've never been there, and I've never really thought about going there. But I think it's important to note that the Philippines had a very harsh and brutal way of dealing with the war on drugs. So that's why I really wanted to mention it in this video. The war on drugs in the Philippines, led by President Rodrigo Duterte in 2016, is characterized by a brutal and controversial approach. It involved widespread anti-drug operations and has been marked by extrajudicial killings, with thousands of suspected drug offenders reported dead. The campaign has been heavily criticized for its human rights abuses and lack of due process. Duterte's aggressive tactics have led to international condemnation and concerns about the rule of law and human rights violations in this country. Now, even before Rodrigo Duterte came to power, there was already a significant drug problem in the Philippines, particularly with methamphetamine, locally known as shabu. Drug trafficking was rampant, but the government primarily focused on arresting people and imprisoning them. Then came Rodrigo Duterte. Elected in 2016, Duterte promised to end the drug problem in 6 months by any means necessary. His methods were brutal. Duterte encouraged extrajudicial killings, where police and vigilante groups executed suspected drug dealers and users without trial. By 2020, an estimated 12 to 30,000 people had been killed in these drug operations. Many of the victims were poor, and there was little to no legal recourse for their families. And even though his tactics were praised by some in the Philippines, they drew sharp criticism from international human rights organizations. The International Criminal Court even launched an investigation into the extrajudicial killings. So after looking at all three of these countries, what have we learned? Well, what I think we learned is that the war on drugs has always been about political power instead of trying to solve the underlying issues involved with addiction and drug taking. But I believe there's hope. Across the UK, US, and the Philippines, we're starting to see signs of harm reduction, decriminalization, and help for those who need it. And I think that's a step in the right direction. And I'm really excited to see what the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, the potential new president, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, and what the Filipino president, Bongbong Marcos, will do. I think that countries are slowly realizing that treating drug problems is much more of a public health issue, and perhaps even mental health issue, than something that requires punishment and force. In conclusion, the war on drugs has been costly and destructive. But I think with bold political leadership, more compassionate policies, we can truly make a step in the right direction and truly help solve the problem with drugs. Anyways, thanks for watching. I really appreciate that you stayed all the way to the end. Please like, subscribe, and if you have anything to say, feel free to comment. I'd really enjoy to hear your thoughts and opinions, and I'll always leave a response. Thanks for watching. See you next time.